By 1847, the plantation stood like a great white wound in the Georgia heat. Columns cracked, paint blistered, windows darkened as though the house itself refused to look upon what it had done. The locals whispered that the land remembered everything. That soil, once fed enough blood, never forgot the taste. She ruled it all from the upper floor. Widowed, young and wealthy beyond consequence, the lady of the plantation dressed always in mourning black, though no one could remember the last funeral she attended. Her voice carried softly, sweet as prayer, yet it bent men and women alike into obedience. Scripture was her weapon, silence her shield, and family was her doctrine. Children were born on the plantation every season. Too many, some with eyes too light, some with features that mirrored the portraits lining the hallway upstairs. No one spoke of it aloud. To notice was to invite punishment, to ask was to disappear. Her sons grew tall and obedient beneath her gaze. They never left the property, never married, never questioned why their mother kept meticulous ledgers locked away from even them. She told them the world beyond the gates was corrupt, that their blood was chosen, that God demanded sacrifice to preserve what was pure. At night, lamps burned where they should not have. Doors opened, then closed. The enslaved quarters fell silent under a fear deeper than the overseer's whip. Women prayed not to be noticed. Men learned to look away. By the time rumors reached the nearby town, the plantation had already learned how to bury sound. What history would later call a secret began, as all true horrors do, as a belief. Quietly nurtured, fiercely protected. That some sins were wholly if committed for the right legacy. The plantation's reputation did not begin with violence or rebellion, but with faces that did not fit the stories told about them. Travelers passing through the county noticed the children first. Small figures barefoot in the dust. Working fields meant for adults, their skin lighter than expected, their hair finer, their eyes an unsettling gray or blue that caught the sun. They bore the unmistakable resemblance of the house on the hill, echoes of its sharp cheekbones and narrow chins, reflections that should not have existed among the enslaved. At first, the neighbors dismissed it as coincidence, the way people often do when truth threatens comfort. The South had its share of mixed bloodlines, the result of cruelty so normalized it barely stirred comment. But this was different. These children did not resemble distant cousins or forgotten masters from decades past. They looked like the current family, like the portraits hanging in the main hall, like the lady herself. Births on the plantation followed a strange pattern. The women chosen to work closest to the house bore children more frequently than others. Those children were kept nearby, assigned lighter labor, watched carefully. Some were dressed better. Some were taught letters in secret. Some vanished into the house and were never seen again. The overseer claimed they had been sold south, yet no bills of sale appeared, no traders arrived. Whispers began to coil through the county church, through taverns, through the back rooms of general stores. Men spoke in lowered voices about unnatural practices, about bloodlines folding in on themselves. Women crossed themselves when the plantation name was mentioned. Yet no one confronted the lady directly. Her wealth insulated her. Her composure disarmed suspicion. When questioned, she spoke of Christian charity, of caring for her property, of God's mysterious designs. The land itself seemed complicit. Crops flourished despite neglect. Storms split around the estate rather than striking it. Even sickness avoided the main house while ravaging nearby farms. People began to say the plantation was protected, that something older and darker than money guarded it. Records offered no clarity. Census rolls contradicted church baptisms. Names repeated too often, dates overlapped, ages did not align. It was as if the plantation existed outside the normal passage of time, governed by its own rules, its own logic. The lady's handwriting appeared everywhere, correcting, amending, erasing. By the late 1840s, the plantation was no longer just a place, but a warning. Parents pulled their children closer when wagons passed its gates. Preachers altered sermons mid-prayer when its name slipped into their thoughts. Everyone sensed that something had been growing there for years, carefully tended, hidden in plain sight, breathing behind white columns and closed doors, waiting to be fully seen. Her husband's death did not arrive with spectacle, only absence. One season he was there, loud with guests and drink. The next his boots remained by the door, untouched, gathering dust like everything else he left behind. The official story spoke of illness, of a sudden failing of the heart, and no one pressed for more. In the South, men died, and estates passed on, as naturally as cotton grew. What changed was not the ownership of the plantation, but the way it breathed afterward. She stepped into authority without announcement. There was no mourning period marked by weakness, no male relative summoned to advise her. The household simply adjusted around her presence, as though it had always been this way. Overseers who had once laughed too freely found their wages cut or their contracts ended. Ministers were invited more often, but only those willing to preach obedience and divine order. Every rule tightened, every routine sharpened into ritual. Religion became the language of control. Scripture was quoted not for comfort, but for justification. She held evening prayers in the main hall, where enslaved people were required to stand in rows beneath portraits of generations past. She spoke softly of duty, of God's will, of suffering as proof of favor. Punishment followed prayer with frightening consistency, teaching everyone that mercy was conditional and silence sacred. The sons were drawn closer to her orbit. Their education shifted inward. Tutors dismissed in favor of lessons she oversaw herself. She corrected their posture, their speech, their thoughts. They were taught that the world beyond the plantation was hostile, corrupt, eager to destroy what their family represented. Fear became loyalty. Isolation became inheritance. She kept records obsessively. Ledgers, journals, loose pages sewn into cloth and hidden behind walls. Births, deaths, movements of people were documented in her hand, then revised when reality failed to suit her order. Names could be changed. Dates could be altered. Truth, she believed, was something disciplined people earned the right to define. Any challenge to her authority was treated as moral failure. An overseer who questioned her instructions was dismissed for impiety. A preacher who hinted at excess was never invited back. An enslaved woman who spoke out was sold away before dawn. The plantation learned quickly that survival depended on compliance, and compliance meant accepting her vision of righteousness. Under her rule, secrecy hardened into law. Doors were locked that had once stood open. The house developed rooms no one spoke of, hallways avoided hours, when certain wings were forbidden. The plantation did not merely function under her control, it bent to it, reshaped itself around her convictions, until fear felt orderly, obedience felt holy, and the silence she demanded settled so deeply into the walls that even the living hesitated to breathe, as though the house itself were listening, waiting for the smallest confession to rise, uninvited, into the air from the moment they could walk unassisted. Her sons were treated less like children and more like vessels for a future only she could see. Affection was measured, deliberate, never spontaneous. Praise came only when obedience was absolute. She spoke to them often of legacy, of blood, of the invisible weight they carried simply by being born into the house. Other boys were allowed to dream of leaving, of land elsewhere, of families of their own. Her sons were taught that leaving was betrayal. Their education was carefully shaped. History lessons centered on noble lineages and divine right. Scripture was interpreted to emphasize chosenness, separation, and dominion. She told them that God worked through families like theirs, that corruption entered the world when bloodlines were diluted or allowed to weaken. They learned to see themselves not as individuals, but as extensions of something sacred and fragile. She controlled what they read, whom they met, and how they understood the people around them. Enslaved individuals were described not as human beings, but as instruments placed by God to serve higher purposes. Compassion was framed as weakness, curiosity as sin. When questions arose, she answered them with certainty, so complete it left no room for doubt. Physical closeness was normalized under the guise of maternal care. Boundaries that existed elsewhere were quietly erased within the house. She insisted on constant presence, constant confession, constant proximity. The boys were encouraged to share every thought, every impulse, every dream with her alone. Privacy was portrayed as secrecy, and secrecy as corruption. As they grew older, she began to speak of responsibility in darker tones. She told them that preservation sometimes required sacrifice, that holy acts were not always understood by the unworthy. The world beyond the plantation, she warned, would never accept what they were destined to do. Only within the family could truth exist without judgment. Doubt, when it surfaced, was swiftly corrected. A son who questioned her teachings was reminded of the suffering outside the gates. Another who expressed interest in marriage was told that outsiders could not be trusted with their blood. Shame became a tool as effective as fear. Love, when offered, was always conditional. By adolescence, their identities were fully entangled with her approval. They no longer asked whether her beliefs were right or wrong, only whether they were fulfilling them correctly. She had succeeded in something far more enduring than obedience. She had replaced conscience with doctrine, desire with duty, and individuality with purpose. The sons learned to see themselves as chosen instruments rather than participants, absolved of responsibility by the righteousness she claimed surrounded them, moving through a life designed. Before they could resist it, bound not by chains, but by belief so deeply rooted it felt like truth itself. Selection on the plantation was never announced, yet everyone learned to recognize it. It began with observation, with quiet attention paid to certain women over others. Strength mattered, but not in the way field labor demanded it. Health, youth, and the absence of visible defiance were noted carefully. Women who worked near the house were watched more closely, their movements tracked, their bodies evaluated as though they were livestock of a rarer, more valuable kind. The lady spoke of improvement as if it were stewardship. She framed her decisions in the language of management and prosperity, insisting that strong workers produced strong offspring, and strong offspring ensured the plantation's future. What she did not say aloud was understood through action. Certain women were reassigned without explanation. Their sleeping quarters changed. Their labor hours shifted to align with the rhythms of the house rather than the fields. Pregnancy followed predictably. Too predictably. Women selected rarely went long without conceiving, regardless of age or prior condition. Refusal was not an option that survived more than once. Coercion took many forms, not all of them violent. Threats of sale, separation from children, harsher labor, or sudden punishment ensured compliance. Silence was enforced through fear and exhaustion. The children born from these unions were treated differently from the moment they drew breath. They were examined closely, their features noted with an unsettling attentiveness. Those who showed the right traits were kept nearby. Their mothers retained longer than usual. Others were quietly removed, sent away before anyone could form attachment. The women learned not to ask where their children went, because asking ensured they would never see them again. The plantation ledger reflected this system in coded language. Births were recorded without fathers' names, or with vague annotations that obscured lineage. The lady's handwriting appeared often in the margins, correcting, clarifying, erasing. She saw no contradiction in her actions. In her mind, this was cultivation, not cruelty. She believed she was shaping something enduring, something ordained. For the women, survival became a matter of emotional retreat. They learned to harden themselves against attachment, to avoid imagining futures for children they might not be allowed to keep. Bonds were formed quietly, then broken without ceremony. Grief was swallowed because there was no space to express it. Over time, the plantation's population changed in ways outsiders could not immediately explain. Faces blurred the lines between enslaved and master, creating a living contradiction that unsettled anyone who noticed too closely. The lady watched it all with calm satisfaction, convinced that she was not violating nature, but perfecting it, bending human lives into a design only she believed she had the right to see. The overseer arrived with no intention of staying long. He was young, recently hired, and eager to prove himself efficient rather than inquisitive. At first, the plantation appeared merely strict, its routines rigid but productive. He kept records as instructed, tallied births and deaths, labor assignments and yields. It was only when he attempted to reconcile one ledger with another that discrepancies began to surface. Numbers refused to align. Children appeared in one book without corresponding entries in another. Ages shifted from page to page. A woman listed as sold months earlier appeared later as having given birth on the property. The same surnames surfaced repeatedly, attached to individuals who should not have shared blood. At first, he blamed his own inexperience. He copied the figures again, slower this time, tracing the lady's handwriting as it overwrote earlier entries. What unsettled him most were the omissions. Fathers were rarely named. When they were, the ink looked fresher than the rest, as though added long after the fact. Some children simply vanished from the record altogether, erased as neatly as chalk from slate. Yet the plantation census never reflected losses. The population remained stable, even grew, defying logic. He began asking quiet questions. Too quiet, perhaps. An older clerk warned him to stop prying. An enslaved man, who had worked there since boyhood, refused to speak, his eyes fixed on the ground. The overseer noticed how conversations ended abruptly when the lady entered a room, how her presence seemed to rearrange truth itself. Late one evening, he was summoned to the house under the pretense of reviewing accounts. She sat across from him, calm and composed, her fingers resting on a stack of ledgers. She spoke kindly, praised his diligence, then corrected him. Not the numbers, but his understanding of them. She explained that records served order, not curiosity. That accuracy was less important than harmony. That God did not require every truth to be written down. After that night, his access changed. Certain books were locked away. His duties narrowed. He was watched. Still, he could not unsee what he had seen. The faces of the children haunted him, their resemblance now unmistakable. He began to suspect that the ledgers were not merely flawed, but deliberately crafted to conceal something vast and generational. The realization isolated him. To speak would be to accuse power itself. To remain silent was to become complicit. He understood then that the plantation's greatest safeguard was not walls or wealth, but the way it trained people to doubt their own perceptions, to accept contradiction as normal, to fear clarity more than ignorance. By the time he considered leaving, he knew it might already be too late. because the plantation did not simply hide its secrets in ink and paper, but in the careful unraveling of anyone who came close enough to recognize them. The son who began to unravel was not the eldest, nor the most favored, but the one who listened too closely. He noticed patterns long before he understood them, gestures exchanged in silence, glances that lingered too long, children who avoided his eyes yet mirrored his face. At first, the discomfort manifested as restlessness. He walked the boundaries of the property at night, staring through the gates as though the darkness beyond might answer questions he could not yet form. The truth arrived gradually, cruel in its patience. It surfaced in overheard whispers, in the way certain women stiffened at his presence, in the careful avoidance practiced by those who knew more than they dared say. One night, he recognized himself in a child's reflection, not vaguely, but unmistakably. The same brow, the same mouth, the same mark near the ear. The realization struck with physical force, leaving him breathless, shaken by a sense of violation that had no language. When he confronted his mother, she did not deny it. She never raised her voice. She spoke of duty, of inheritance, of divine necessity. She told him he had been chosen to preserve something greater than himself, that his discomfort was the price of righteousness. She framed his revulsion as weakness, his horror as immaturity. To question her was to question God's will, she said, and God did not forgive defiance. Something broke then, quietly but irreversibly. He began to see the plantation as a prison rather than a legacy. The walls that once felt protective now pressed inward. He avoided the house, the ledgers, the rituals. His mother noticed immediately. Withdrawal was not permitted. She tightened her hold, increased her surveillance, reminded him constantly of what awaited those who failed her. The decision to flee was not dramatic. There was no declaration, no farewell. It formed slowly, out of desperation rather than courage. He collected scraps of information from the overseer, memorized paths through the woods, learned which guards slept lightly and which drank too much. Every step toward escape felt like sacrilege, yet staying felt worse. On the night he chose, the plantation was unnaturally quiet. He passed cabins where children slept unaware of the truths written into their bodies. He crossed land he had been told belonged to him, knowing now it was soaked in suffering. At the edge of the property, doubt surged. Fear clawed at him, not of capture, but of the world beyond the lie he had been raised inside. He was caught before dawn. Whether betrayed or simply anticipated, he never learned. He was returned without spectacle, without punishment visible to others. After that, he changed. He spoke less. He obeyed more. The fire that had driven him toward freedom was smothered, not extinguished, buried deep beneath compliance. The plantation continued as it always had, but something unseen had shifted, because even in silence, his failed escape left a fracture, a proof that belief could crack, that the doctrine binding the house together was not invincible, and that knowledge, once gained, could be forced into hiding, but never fully erased. The cellar was not discovered by accident so much as inevitability. Years of whispers had drawn attention downward, toward the parts of the house no one was meant to acknowledge. It lay beneath a false floor in the west wing, concealed by furniture too heavy to move without purpose. When it was finally uncovered, the air that escaped carried the weight of damp stone and something older, a smell like rust and confinement that had nowhere to go. The room was smaller than expected, narrow and low, ceilinged, its walls marked by scratches that were not the work of animals. Chains hung from iron rings set into the stone, their links worn smooth by repeated use. There were stains the color of old earth, soaked so deeply into the floor they could not be scrubbed away. This was not a place of momentary punishment, but of prolonged intent. What turned suspicion into certainty were the journals stacked carefully along one wall, wrapped in oilcloth, preserved with care that bordered on reverence. The handwriting was unmistakable. Page after page detailed births, pairings, outcomes. Language stripped of emotion reduced human lives to variables and results. Notes were made about resemblance, temperament, obedience. Successes were underlined. Failures crossed out. Generations unfolded in ink, revealing patterns that no ledger upstairs could ever safely hold. Among the journals were personal effects that told quieter truths. A child's ribbon. A small shoe. A lock of hair tied with thread. These items bore no explanation, no recorded purpose, yet they spoke more loudly than the words. They suggested attachment, regret, or perhaps trophies kept to mark achievements too shameful to name. The seller also held records that contradicted the plantation's official history. Dates of death that never appeared in church books. Sales that never occurred. Names that were erased above ground but preserved below. The contradictions formed a map of deliberate deception, a structure built to withstand scrutiny, by fragmenting truth across spaces, hiding the most damning pieces where only the initiated would ever look. Those who entered the cellar did not leave unchanged. The physical evidence stripped away the comfort of ambiguity. What had once been rumor hardened into fact. The plantation was not merely immoral by custom, but meticulously designed around exploitation that extended beyond labor into blood and lineage. The cellar was the engine room of that design, the place where theory met flesh. Even the house above seemed altered by its revelation. Floors creaked differently, as though aware of what they concealed. Walls felt thinner. The distance between past and present collapsed, making it impossible to pretend that these acts belonged to another time or another mind. The cellar did not scream its secrets. It did not need to. It waited, patient and intact, holding proof that the plantation's legacy was not built on wealth or land alone, but on deliberate acts committed in darkness, recorded carefully, hidden expertly, and sustained long enough to believe they might never be brought into the light. The plantation did not collapse under fire or revolt, but under words spoken where silence had ruled for decades. The confession did not come from the lady herself, nor from any authority sent to investigate. It came from within the structure she had built so carefully, from someone shaped by her doctrine, who could no longer carry its weight. When the truth finally emerged, it did so unevenly, in fragments, whispered first, then repeated, until it could no longer be contained. The son who spoke did not frame his confession as accusation. He spoke as one confessing sin, steeped in the language he had been taught since childhood. He described duty, obedience, and acts he claimed were required of him. He spoke of births he had witnessed, of children who bore his face, of a righteousness that had curdled into horror once he understood its cost. His words unsettled listeners, not because they were shouted, but because they were delivered with calm certainty, as though he were reciting scripture. At first, the confession was dismissed as madness. The idea was too grotesque, too destabilizing to accept readily. But denial failed where evidence accumulated. Others began to speak, cautiously at first, then with growing urgency. An enslaved woman recounted being chosen, reassigned, silenced. A former clerk confirmed irregular records. The overseer, long gone but not untouched, provided copies of altered ledgers he had kept against his better judgment. The plantation's authority began to unravel not through force, but through contradiction. Statements no longer aligned. Dates conflicted. Stories overlapped in ways that could not be explained away. The same calm order that had protected the estate now worked against it, because once exposed to scrutiny, its precision revealed intention. The lady herself never confessed. When confronted, she spoke of persecution, of misunderstanding, of God's will distorted by weak minds. Her composure did not falter. Even as the world, she had insulated herself from pressed inward. But her refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing only hastened the end. Silence, once her greatest shield, became evidence of guilt. The downfall was administrative rather than dramatic. Titles were challenged, accounts frozen. The plantation was seized not because of a single crime, but because of a pattern too vast to ignore. Families connected to the estate distanced themselves. Churches revised their records. Names were struck from honor rolls. What lingered after was not justice in any complete sense, but exposure. The secret that had sustained the plantation for generations could no longer survive daylight. Children once hidden were acknowledged. The myth of divine order dissolved into something unmistakably human and cruel. The plantation fell quiet in a way it never had before, not with fear, but with reckoning, its legacy fractured not by rebellion or ruin, but by the simple, devastating act of telling the truth aloud years later. The plantation stood empty, its fields surrendered to weeds and red clay. The columns still rose against the sky, but without authority, without purpose, like bones after flesh has long since abandoned them. Locals avoided the road that passed its gates, not out of superstition alone, but out of an unspoken agreement that some places were better left to remember themselves. The lady died quietly. No trial ever reached her. No public reckoning unfolded at her feet. She passed in a locked room, attended by no family, her doctrines outliving her body, only briefly before dissolving under scrutiny. What she built could not survive without her voice enforcing it, without fear carefully reapplied each day. Control, once loosened, proved impossible to reclaim. The sons scattered. Some vanished into anonymity, changing names, erasing origins as best they could. Others remained close, trapped between guilt and inheritance, unable to reconcile what they had been taught with what they had done. None ever returned to the house as masters. It would not have accepted them. Those born in silence carried the longest burden. Children who had once been hidden now lived with names that told only part of their story. Some sought distance from the land. Others stayed, determined that their lives would no longer be defined by secrecy. The truth, once exposed, followed them like a shadow, not as condemnation, but as a reminder of survival. The ledgers were archived. The journals studied. Historians argued over motives, terminology, responsibility. They debated how such a system endured so long without collapse. What they could never fully capture was the atmosphere. The way belief had replaced conscience, the way order had masqueraded as holiness, the way an entire world had bent itself around one woman's certainty. Time did what it always does. It softened the edges of horror without erasing it. The plantation decayed slowly, roof caving in, walls surrendering to vines. Rain seeped into the cellar and blurred ink on the pages left behind, but enough remained to ensure the story would not vanish entirely. In the end, the land outlived the lie built upon it. The soil reclaimed what it had been forced to hold. And though the house still stood for a while, empty and listening, it no longer guarded a secret. It simply bore witness.